Stephen Wolfram is the creator of Mathematica, Wolfram Alpha, and the Wolfram language, the originator of the Wolfram Physics Project, the author of A New Kind of Science and other books, and the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. Jonathan Gorard is a research mathematician at the University of Cambridge, an algorithms R&D consultant at Wolfram Research, and one of the principal researchers on the Wolfram Physics Project. His work lies at the intersection of mathematics, physics, and computation, with interests ranging from mathematical, logical, and computational complexity to general relativity and the foundations of quantum mechanics.
Stephen Wolfram and Jonathan Gorard, welcome to the program.
Hi.
Hey, great to be here.
Now, the obvious question is, will this bring us closer to general artificial intelligence? And does that scare you, gentlemen?
Well, I've spent some significant part of my life working on things related to AI and kind of computation meets AI. I don't think that you got to understand that this work on fundamental physics is dealing with very, very low-level machine code of our world. And it's, for example, a nucleus is a thousandth trillionth of a meter across. Okay, a proton, for example, is a thousand trillionth of a meter across. The kinds of things we're dealing with, and that's already small, but the things that we're dealing with are a trillionth of a meter across. Okay, really, really small. And the sort of interaction of things at that level of smallness with it's fascinating to know how that works. There are extreme places in the universe, particularly connected with things like black holes, where you start actually being able to be sensitive to what's happening at that level. But in terms of your everyday technological innovation, it's fairly far away. Now, one thing people like me who like to understand sort of the flow of history are fond of trying to figure out is, if you were Newton and you'd figured out a bunch of stuff about Newton's laws of motion and gravity and so on, did you know that there could be artificial satellites? And why would you, if there could be artificial satellites, what on earth would you do with them? And like when Alan Turing was inventing sort of the idea of computers, could you have predicted that a big swath of what computers will be used for is things like word processing and web communication and so on? Well, so having said all of this, I'm just I'm kind of adding humility to the statement that I'm making, that I don't see kind of a place where you jump from sort of the fundamental theory of physics to technology. Now, having said that, I just agreed to go to some NASA workshop and talk about whether faster than light travel will be possible and so on. And I still have to figure that out, because in our model, we should have very definite things to say about it, although there are technical issues in actually figuring out what one can say. But so, that is to say that thinking about fundamental physics is, mostly pretty far away from current technology. Now, if you think about artificial intelligence, one of the things that the possibilities of computation are very great. And, I've spent some part of my life studying the science of that and building technology based on that. And what we see in AI is kind of us mining small pieces of those computational capabilities that exist. The pieces we choose to mine are the pieces that align with the things that we care about doing. That is, we can have a computation that does all kinds of elaborate things. It produces these amazing pictures, these amazing things. In fact, lots of things that happen in nature I think of as computations, whether it's the operation of the weather or lots of other kinds of things. They're all just doing computations. The question is, when you say, is that AI? Well, the answer is, it depends on, to think of it as something that is aligned with our notion of intelligence and our set of things that we want to do. That's really the issue. And in fact, again, I've spent a large part of my life building this computational language called Wolfram language, whose main purpose is to provide a bridge between sort of what is computationally possible in this universe of possible computations and what we humans think about and care about doing. So in other words, we have to be able to tell, we've got an AI. The AI is extremely powerful, it can do all kinds of things, but it's like, well, it can do all kinds of computations, many of which we would say, well, okay, fine, you do that computation, but it's like, some swirling of air in that's a piece of some weather system. It's like, well, that computation, it happens and it's kind of complicated, but we don't know why you do that. And so the challenge is to make this bridge between things we want to be able to do and what computation makes possible. So the real issue of AI is it's kind of, how do we tell this very powerful sort of thing, that very powerful capability of computation, how do we align that with things we care about? Now, one of the things that I think will come out of this theory of physics is people have thought of computation as a thing we build, not a thing that our whole world is made from. Before people like Newton, ideas, there are ideas that came from Newton of things like force and momentum and so on. Those ideas have become commonplace ideas in our general way of thinking about the world. Computation, we've become familiar with through our actual use of computers, but we're not as familiar with the idea that our whole world works using this paradigm. And I think this theory of physics will help people to understand that that is the underlying paradigm for everything. And so kind of the intuition that you get from that paradigm can be applied everywhere. So ideas like computational irreducibility, the fact that you can't predict what will happen in a system without just following all the steps to see what it does. That's an idea that is a fundamental idea that comes from this computational paradigm. And that's an idea that I think will be applicable to lots of things in the world, independent of the specifics of physics. It's kind of like, when Copernicus was doing his thing, the fact that he managed to simplify the computation of the positions of planets and so on relative to what Ptolemy and people like that had done, the fact that he was able to do that by assuming that the Earth went around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth, was a primarily technical interest. The number of people who in detail cared about that was quite small. But the very idea that science and mathematics could show you something that seemed not intuitive, like the Earth isn't stationary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that had much greater implications. And I think what we'll see from this work in physics is, again, people understanding that that computation is a much deeper and more global thing than had been realized before. Now, if you ask what will the AIs, will the AIs and computation sort of take over the world? Well, the fact is the world works using computation we don't understand already. That's how, like the weather, for example, which is sometimes said to have a mind of its own, so to speak. It's just, in a sense, doing a computation. It's a computation that we don't happen to control. We don't necessarily happen to understand the point of, and so on. With kind of the computations that AIs do, it is an interesting challenge to tell the AIs to kind of define what the AIs do to be the things that we want to have them do. So, for example, one, the sort of the ethics of AIs. What do we want the AIs to do? And people sort of say, well, we want the AIs to be nice to humans. How on earth do we define that? What is the people have the idea, let's get the AIs to do, to act just the way humans act. Well, that's, many people would say, well, that's not a good idea at all. Lots of they should act like the best humans. Which ones are the best humans? Hard to know. It's a complicated thing. And in fact, what one realizes as one starts thinking about, what we need to do is, AIs can do all kinds of things. We can define what kinds of things they should be doing, but we have to have some language, some way of representing what it is that we want them to do. We have to have some contract with the AIs, some constitution for the AIs that kind of defines sort of what we want the future of of what we want the computations that happen in our world to be like. And it's there's very immediate versions of this. There's one I've been a bit involved in, which is when you read a news feed or you go use a search engine, it's providing you, it's saying, these are the things that the AI thinks you'll be interested in. And people say, well, I don't like that. You're not telling me about this, this thing or that thing. I don't like that. And one of the questions is, to what extent should the AIs, how should you define the system of ethics, so to speak, for those AIs? Because that's the place where probably we are most immediately exposed to AI, is in the selection of content for of things we see on the internet. And I think that's kind of the first skirmish in the kind of AI war. And part of the issue there, in a sense, the problem of AI is very much a problem of a reflection of us. That is, what do we want? What do we want the AIs to be like, and how do we distill the sort of the essence of what we humans think is a good thing, and then how do we do that in a way that doesn't say, okay, we're going to lock the AI constitution in the year 2021. We're going to build the constitution for the AIs, and that's going to be the way it is forever, because if we give them any wiggle room, there could be trouble, so to speak. So there's a lot of challenges there.
One would ultimately hope that whatever AI we create understands the word no.
Oh boy. You see, the problem with that is, as I said, I've spent some part of my life building computational languages that try and sort of bridge the human thinking to computation. It's a truly challenging thing to, what one is trying to do there is to take something like human language, and this question of how you take a thing like that. So you say, like, for example, typical example, you say, you're telling your AI, no, don't do that. You say, no. Okay, does that mean twice the amount of no? It might not. It might mean, well, yes, actually.
Or it asks you why.
Right. Well, I mean, the question of why is that whenever you try to answer the question why, you are effectively just saying, how do you knit what is going on into the kind of thought patterns of whoever or whatever you're explaining it to? And its notion of why is, it's for us, the why eventually, folds back into sort of the history of our civilization and kind of ideas that are somehow accepted by us as humans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's where you root a question like why. I mean, for example, in the physics project, one of the things that's sort of a frontier of that is a very fundamental philosophical question. Why does the universe exist? And one question there, I've literally just been thinking about this, is what kind of an answer could that have? If we were going to give a scientific answer to that question, what kind of an answer would it have? It's kind of a proof of, within some system, this is why the universe exists. It's like saying, you say to me, okay, the square of the, the sum of the squares of two sides of a triangle, of a right triangle, is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. Say, why is that true? And you start saying, well, this and this and this and this and this. It's like that's kind of the structure of a proof. What would it look like to have a proof about why the universe exists? And is that something where we might be able to scientifically show that no such proof can exist? And that's kind of in a sense, one is spoiled by, if one actually thinks one has a framework to find a fundamental theory of physics, one starts thinking about questions like that, which otherwise I would just said, that's far away. We're not even close. But now that we have sort of the things that work up towards a question like that, it's like, well, actually, let's try and see whether we can say something about that.
Is it rooted in history, though, or is it inherent? For example, one can correct a child that says, I'm going to touch that hot stove. And you say, no, don't do that. But then they say, why? Before they actually learn what it means to actually touch a stove. And they'll either trust you or they'll touch the stove. Is this the case with an AI? I mean, would an AI consistently just question us inherently? Why do you do this? Why is this? As it learns and gathers information about the universe. So would that be something that just is natural to any questioning being that is curious about its world, or is it really rooted in history and unique to humanity?
This question of asking for a story, a narrative about why something is true, that's a very fundamental thing that people like. People think through stories and so on. They think through this kind of narrative of how things unfold in time. We don't have other examples of intelligence, so we don't really know. I mean, the first example of alien intelligence that we have is AI. And the fact is that AI does not, in any way that we can perceive, think in terms of narratives in the same way. It's not, one of the things that's difficult in understanding an AI, we build lots of AI systems in our language and so on. And, you look at, let's say, an image identifier, it's saying, is this an elephant? Is it a teacup? What is it? Okay. You say, you say, let's open up the image identifier. Let's look at what all those layers of neural net actually do. And somewhere in those layers of neural net, it's probably saying, this thing is very round, this thing has legs on it, that's an elephant, that's a teacup type thing. But it's making a bunch of distinctions that are not distinctions for which we humans are really focused on. It's making distinctions that are optimized for the 10,000 kinds of things it can recognize. But that, for us humans, we might say, oh, that thing is very bushy, that thing is very smooth. Those are words and distinctions that we choose to make. If you start saying, how do we describe, I don't know, different kinds of, some feature of clouds that we're not very familiar with, we wouldn't have words to describe that. And similarly, the things that AIs are using that sort of optimize their purpose of identifying images, for example, they don't map well onto human language. And so us humans, this question of could we learn, could we get inside the mind of the AI? Well, we humans have developed language to give sort of a symbolic representation of certain kinds of things that we tend to like to think about. The things that AIs have learnt to make sense of the world don't follow the sort of historical traditions of our ways of thinking about the world. So it's a seriously difficult thing to communicate. I mean, so for example, in human language there might be 50,000 words that we use. Well, in sort of the things that an AI will learn to distinguish images, let's say, you could get to the point where there are 1 million different distinctions it's making. Now, some of those could be mapped, correspond to sort of human language words that we know, but many will not. And in a sense, we could say, well, okay, let's look at what the AIs do, and let's, in the future of education, let's teach all the humans how to get inside the mind of the AI to see what it's doing. It's kind of hopeless. I mean, it's I think it's something where the way we have to think about it is, for most of history, we have not known the mechanisms by which things work. It is a phenomenon of post-industrial revolution phenomenon, basically, that the typical machine you have is something where you can imagine, I can open it up and see the gears inside and see how it works. Of course, it isn't even true with modern computers, where we're not even, it's extremely hard to see how a modern computer actually works. I mean, you can see what the pieces are underneath, but to really understand what's going on is very hard. But this idea that there was sort of this, we can understand the mechanism. When people were riding around on horses all the time, the mechanism of how the horse works inside was not well understood. What was understood was you could, pull the reins of the horse one way and the horse would turn in that direction. And that was sort of an operational way of making use of that thing that is the horse. And so similarly, I think our view of computation has to be much more like, it's like the horse, so to speak, rather than it's like the governor of the steam engine, so to speak.
Now that sounds scary, because that seems to me to be how you end up with a machine civilization creating von Neumann probes that eat a galaxy. I mean, fully understanding is dangerous, right?
Well, this is the phenomenon of computational irreducibility. It is not possible. You have a choice. If you say, okay, let's say you say, I want to fully understand how the content is picked for me on the internet. Okay? You want to fully understand it. Okay. The algorithm that you can use has to be very simple. You can't use anything like the algorithms that are actually used today. And in general, the trade-off is, if you want computation to be able to achieve what it can achieve, you can't box it in and say, I have to understand every aspect of what it's doing. That's the trade-off. I mean, you could say, well, I need to understand everything, but then there's not a lot that can be done. In other words, and many of the things that we humans want to do would not be at least, we'd lead a very impoverished life if we had to understand everything. I mean, needless to say, the very operation of humans themselves is not readily understood, for example, by other humans. I mean, if you insisted that every human operate only in a way that we could readily understand, then every human would be sort of operating only according to some simple reflexes that are, that we could readily understand. And that wouldn't be, I don't think anybody would really want that. I think it's something where the issue is to, you're trying to, the goal is, you have this thing, it's very powerful, how do you define for it? I mean, the good news about AI is that AI has no more fundamental sense of what it's trying to achieve than the weather has a fundamental sense of what it's trying to achieve. That is, whatever a computer is, a computer sitting on your desk in a box, just hanging out, there is no intrinsic sense of purpose for that computer. If the computer is going to do something, it does something because we gave it some sense of purpose. We said, go make paper clips or whatever it is. Go explore the galaxy. There is no intrinsic sort of notion of purpose that is an abstract kind of thing. Just as we don't see that in, we don't see that in the natural world. We don't see that it's not a thing. That purpose is a human construct, and when we say we don't want you to do that, that's bad. That's a very human kind of idea. So, for example, the von Neumann probes eating the galaxy type thing. You might say, oh my God, that's the ultimate anti-conservation. That's the ultimate ruin the environment situation. That's really shocking. But that's a human statement. I mean, the fact that, is it bad that a black hole at the center of our galaxy is gobbling up stars? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to put an ethics on that black hole. You might say, well, gosh, it's going to destroy, all these planets around these stars. It kind of sounds bad to me, but I don't know whether there's an intrinsic sense in which, the sort of the karma of the universe is destroyed by that, so to speak. I mean, that's this question about whether, for example, whether you can attribute purpose to the universe. I mean, this is ultimately a theological kind of issue. I think the whole question of what, when you look at the sort of ultimate future, I mean, one of the things actually that held me up to some extent in working on the fundamental theory of physics was the following realization, that we exist in biological form these days, eventually sort of, the disembodied soul, so to speak, as a digital thing will be perfectly doable. Now, I kind of wonder, I've been recording, every keystroke I type for decades and so on, and I kind of wonder, have I recorded enough about myself that you could make a bot of me that would be a really pretty good approximation, without any of the sort of biological instantiation. And I think that there'll come a time when some future of what we think of as human civilization ends up being virtualized in that form. And one of the things that one realizes is, once things are virtualized like that, the actual operation of the universe, the actual machine code of the universe, doesn't really make much of a difference, because by the time one's experience is based on this kind of virtualized existence, just like one computer is as good as any other computer in running a certain kind of program. It just happens to compile to machine code differently. The same will be true in that situation.
Could I just add one thing to the AI question in relation to John's original question about relation to fundamental physics?
Go ahead.
It's kind of it's a trivial point, but I think it's one that's still worth making. In that, if we do succeed in this approach, in this approach to finding the fundamental theory of physics, then it will have at least one tangible implication for sort of general artificial intelligence, which is that program will be sort of the first computer program that, if it is a program that successfully reproduces our entire physical universe, it will be the first program that is kind of provably capable of general artificial intelligence, albeit in a very, very inefficient way. Because one of the issues with AI is if you give me a computer program and you say this is an AI, I can run Turing tests on it or whatever, but at some level I can always mount the sort of standard philosophical zombie argument. I can mount some variant of the John Searle Chinese room argument and claim that even though it looks and quacks like an artificial intelligence, that there isn't any consciousness or anything inside, or it doesn't have a representation of the world, or it doesn't have a self or a mind or whatever. But if we succeed in finding the fundamental theory of physics, then if nothing else, we could just run that program for 13.8 billion years, and it will produce things like us that that presumably, if the word intelligence is to have any meaning, then surely we, as the people who kind of define the concept, we must exhibit it. We must exhibit these concepts like consciousness and intelligence and things almost by definition. And so one of the things that I find quite amusing is that if we succeed in finding this theory, it will be the sort of, I think, the first genuinely uncontroversial piece of general or instance of general artificial intelligence, one that is sort of provably capable of intelligence, at least to the extent that we are capable of intelligence. Like I say, it's an incredibly inefficient way of reproducing it, but it's at least one that's kind of that's relatively uncontroversial if it succeeds.
That's a good point. I mean, it's like people say, is there anything in the brain that is beyond sort of computation? And this is saying, well, ultimately, no, there isn't. It's really far, far down there that it's all that we can know that it's all computational. But it's like, it also gives one, in the sort of Copernican way, it gives one the sense that things are about computation, and it's not bizarre that something could be merely computational, that it doesn't need these extra flashes of the consciousness field or something that go beyond the sort of merely computational, so to speak.
deployed.